Now, how about dosage? How about dosage? What's the right dosage? We know what the wrong dosage is, don't we? That's easier to specify. Take Waco, Texas. Who did right on that one, I'd have no idea. But thank God. God, aren't you glad you're not Attorney General of the United States or President of the United States? Anyway, but the man who led those people had a capacity to give them courage, didn't he? What a capacity, right? But I think that's overdosage. I think that's big overdosage. I hope they don't do that to me, God knows. And we see this in charismatic leadership all the time. That's what we mean by charismatic. The capacity to induce courage in other people of phenomenal proportions. And I mentioned my father's experience with Douglas MacArthur and his capacity, as a good general should, to really dose up your troops so they'll even die in your behalf, the way that happened in Waco, right? That's routine. Lots of people can do that. But that isn't the kind of thing I'm talking about. And that might be very nice. It might produce a wonderful short-term result. But as soon as I disappeared and the person was left on their own, then plump down to ground. And read Irving Yalom's accounts of the results of charismatic leadership in group treatment and what the result of it is. And how frequently you even get psychotic results when something happens with this charismatic leader. So I don't want that. So that's too much dose, right? But then we have another kind of dose problem. We can have too little, where the therapist doesn't care, or the therapist is afraid to use themselves, or the therapist is themselves intimidated by the situation. So there isn't the capacity to be. Now that's not a very good dose-response curve, whatever you call it nowadays. That isn't very precise, and I never expected it would be. But we do have sort of outside limits of what the dosage of our giving ourselves needs to be. And finally, what's transmitted? Well, I've said courage, but that really isn't what's transmitted, except as a result, perhaps. What am I transmitting? Self-esteem? Believing in myself? Is that what I'm transmitting? Perhaps it is. But that's tricky too, because here we're playing with the problem of suggestion, right? Remember the ancient bugaboo of psychoanalysis. You can read the history of psychoanalysis in large part as Freud's attempt to avoid the criticism of suggestion. And I think a lot of the austere, removed analytic technique developed because they knew that they were dealing with suggestible subjects, and second of all, they had a powerful set of ideas, and the whole thing might have been produced by them, the therapists. And if you want to read the most famous critique of psychoanalysis, been written in the last 10, 15 years, Adolf Grunbaum's attack on psychoanalytic reliability, it's all based upon the fact that all the results are much better explained by suggestion than anything else. And Freud knew this very well. So is all this talk about courage, giving courage, persistence, is that all just suggestion? Well, that's a very important point, because it cannot be suggestion. Because of its suggestion, we have essentially divorced ourselves from the idea of the psychologically real. Because it has to be something which is for the patient real already, not because I think they ought to feel that way. And this is intellectually a very tenuous moment in these suggestions of mine, because it could be suggestion. But I say that what's transmitted is an amplification of the person's own voice. That's my claim. Now that's a pretty weak response, because that, God knows, is subject to suggestion. And I'm certainly subject to self-deception as much or more than most people, especially when one gets full of a good idea, or an idea one thinks is good, right? Nothing like it for buoying oneself up, right? Especially if everything else is going wrong. But my point is that what we mean to transmit through this medium in the appropriate dosage is the call of the person's own interests. So that we do the same thing in reverse that we did the other way, one way, we do it in reverse from Cezanne. You remember the model I tried to present was of the motif, that is the scene before him, being watched, studied, and allowed to impact on his emotional apprehension and be seen for itself. Be seen for itself, right? So that it was not the cliche apple, but the apple that Lawrence called an apple left alone. So in reverse, when I transmit back what I think is the motif of the patient, I have to, and the patient has to listen to it with the same austerity, with the same skepticism, to be sure this is what is for them, right? And it's so tricky, isn't it? Because the more passionately you hope for the person, the more precipitate you can be, the more presumptuous you can be. Right? So here there is a great austerity asked of the practitioner that we, and it's a paradoxical austerity because it is a passionate austerity. Right? Well, let me finish up very quickly. This case illustrated very nicely so many things, but also the fact that all our solutions are wrong. There's recently been a series of observations made about the way children learn to do things, and it turns out, at least by these workers, that they all have their own method. That there isn't a single way to learn to pick up a cup or to utter a word, that they all have their own solutions, and they all attempt very various solutions. And some of them invent new solutions, these little people that go along. So that as we watch what the impact of this infusion, we hope, of courage is, we must expect to be baffled, surprised by the way the person acts. Well, take my patient. She decided she would make an overture to her friend's brother. She had a terrible time writing the letter. She brought it in and read it to me and asked me what I thought. And I said, she seemed to have gotten across what she said she wanted to get across, which was true. And she lost it twice before she could get into the mailbox. And then she thought she dropped it into some kind of special mail that requires, I don't know, what is that? Express mail or something when it wasn't. Everything was obstructing this event. But she did it, and she sent it to him. And then she disappeared. I couldn't turn her back, but she disappeared. She went away for about 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, on a vacation. I thought I'd read this right, that I knew that she was not, I knew, here I am, a lunatic. I thought that she was perfectly safe in this man's hands. He was going to treat her right. I didn't know how it would come out, of course. And I sort of prayed for her the way you do with your children. And she got a letter back. And it sort of broke her up, because it said, I was so hoping you would write this letter. Yes, you're right. I've always thought you were the most wonderful person I ever met. But, did you hear the but coming? But the last time we met and you turned your back and walked out, I gave up. And there's this girl that's been calling me for a couple of years now. Well, you know how the story goes, right? This girl's been calling me for a couple of years now, and so I called her back. And we're going to Hawaii next week to spend a week and see how it works. Well, that isn't a Dear John letter, is it? Not exactly. But it has some of that, doesn't it? Well, of course, you can imagine how she felt. She was pleased, and she came to me and said, you were right. She said to me, you were right. I didn't believe he really cared about me. And there, wasn't that beautiful? She didn't. Anybody listening to that story would have laughed at her. Of course he cares about you. There were incident after incident of ways in which he'd gone out of his way to see her, but she couldn't believe it. And so she said to me, you were right. You were right. He loved me. And then And then she felt sad, and then she felt relieved, of course, because she wouldn't have to go forward with it now. But there was left, the precipitate of that transaction was she was left with a sense that he loved me, you know. They couldn't take that away from her. They couldn't take that away from her. He loved me, right? Well, meantime, back on the farm, right, there's another man. See, I didn't know how this was going to work, and it's surprising. I thought he might have come running, the first guy, you know, and it's still possible he might, but I don't think so. Anyway, but there was another guy that she'd also liked, and this, of course, warmed my heart. Isn't it terrible to have your heart warmed by other people's pain? But this warmed my heart because I knew something was going on, because every time she got near this man, she would drop something. And she sometimes turned her back on him, you know. And she also gave a description of him that indicated he was a serious contender. And so she says to me one day, she says, you know, maybe I ought to try this again. Well, I don't know how that's come out yet, and it's ongoing, as they say. But it felt a little stronger. It felt a little stronger, especially because it was accompanied by the first real moves she'd made with her art that were more than just a sitting down running off. And so I thought maybe something will happen. Well, can you stand it if I read that last thing of Nietzsche once again? Is that all right? One must learn to love. This is our experience in music. We must first learn in general to hear fully, and to distinguish a theme or a melody. We have to isolate and limit it as a life by itself. Then we need to exercise effort and goodwill in order to endure it. In spite of its strangeness, we need patience toward its aspect and expression, and indulgence toward what is odd in it. And in the end, there comes a moment when we are accustomed to it, when we expect it, and when it dawns upon us that we should miss it if it were lacking. And then it goes on to exercise its spell and charm more and more, and it does not cease until we have become its humble and enraptured lovers who want it again and again. It is thus with us, not only in music, it is precisely thus that we have learned to love everything that we love. And here, this extraordinary passage, I think. We are always recompensed finally for our goodwill, our patience, our reasonableness and gentleness toward what is unfamiliar, by the unfamiliar throwing off its veil and presenting itself as a new beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality. Isn't that nice? As if the hospitality had created the thing, and perhaps it had. How do you know it was there? But a function of the hospitality.